Hello there. Tonight we're going to talk about the fascinating history of ancient India, exploring the rise and fall of its most influential kings and kingdoms. This complex tapestry of rich history is woven together, highlighting the key players and events that shaped the Indian subcontinent for centuries. Before kings raised their swords, before ruling families etched their names into stone, and long before anyone thought to call it India, there was just land, fertile, vast, sun-drenched land, and water, lots of it. So before we wade into the thick jungles of royal politics, do take a moment to like the video, subscribe if this kind of thing thrills your inner historian, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now light a candle, maybe pour some chai, and let's time travel all the way back, not just centuries, but millennia, into a world where the only kingdoms were built from mud brick, and the only laws were the rhythms of the river. Welcome to the Indus Valley Civilization. Picture this, it's 2600 BCE. While Egypt is stacking its third pyramid, and Sumerians are busy inventing cuneiform, the people of the Indus Valley are quietly doing something radical. They're inventing cities. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, two of the civilization's shining examples, weren't just glorified villages. They were urban blueprints, complete with wide streets, grid layouts, and drainage systems that still make modern city planners nod with begrudging respect. Every home, yes, even the modest ones, had access to water, bathing areas, and something resembling a toilet. This was a culture that believed in order, not just societal order, but architectural and civic order. The kind that makes you think, wow, these people would have crushed it on Pinterest. But here's what's really fascinating. They didn't build giant statues of their rulers. No pharaohs, no ziggurats, no thundering declarations of who conquered what. The Indus people seemed more interested in granaries than glory, more civic than cinematic. Were there kings? Probably. But unlike their contemporaries, these rulers didn't carve their faces into mountains or claim divine bloodlines. They ruled, perhaps, with spreadsheets instead of spears. Now, if you're wondering why we don't know more about these ancient proto-bureaucrats, it's because their writing is still a complete mystery. The Indus script, found on seals and pottery, taunts archaeologists like a crossword with no clues. It's beautiful, compact, possibly syllabic, or logographic, or symbolic, or all of the above, or none. And despite thousands of inscriptions, not a single one has been definitively cracked. This means everything we know is actually a delicate mosaic of archaeology, educated guesswork, and mild academic bickering. But here's the thing, even in mystery, the Indus Valley sparkles. It tells us that before kings wore crowns, civilizations wore common sense. These were people who built peace, not palaces, who planned for floods, not conquests, and who vanished just like that. Around 1900 BCE, the great Indus cities begin to decline. Why? That's still up for debate. Some say the rivers shifted. Others point to climate change, drought, or internal collapse. No one blames alien invasions yet, but give it time. What we do know is that by 1500 BCE, a new cultural wave is washing over the subcontinent, and it brings with it horses, chariots, fire rituals, and poetry that refuses to die. Enter the Indo-Aryans. Now let's clear this up. This wasn't an invasion in the helmets and bloodshed sense. More likely, it was a gradual migration, a cultural fusion. Think less Game of Thrones and more complicated roommate situation with deep spiritual undertones. The Indo-Aryans brought with them the Rig Veda, a collection of hymns so ancient it makes Homer look like a late bloomer. These hymns weren't just songs. They were theological frameworks, social blueprints, and linguistic fossils, preserved orally for centuries before ever being written down. If the Indus Valley was about drains and bricks, the Vedic age was about gods, cows, and hierarchy. The early Vedic society wasn't ruled by kings, at least not in the traditional sense. Power was spread across tribal chieftains, or rajas, each claiming a divine spark, but still answering to a council, or at least to the priest who managed the sacrifice schedule. This was a world of ritual, where fire wasn't just heat, it was a hotline to heaven. The gods of this age weren't marble statues on altars. They were elemental forces. Indra the storm, Agni the fire, Varuna the lawgiver. They didn't grant wishes. They expected hymns. Long, poetic, occasionally confusing hymns. Cattle were wealth. Warriors were revered. And social order started to crystallize into a rough hierarchy. Priests on top, warriors just below, everyone else somewhere in the manual labor section. But as the centuries rolled on, something shifted. Tribes grew, populations swelled, and someone, somewhere probably said, "You know, we could really use a centralized monarchy and a better land tax system." And thus, kings were born. By around 600 BCE, India was no longer just a quilt of small tribes and rituals. It had matured into a chessboard of emerging regional powers, 16 major ones to be exact, known as the Mahajanapadas. These were the first real kingdoms of India. Each had a capital, a standing army, and a political ambition that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. Some were monarchies. Others, surprisingly, were republics, with councils and voting and everything. Yes, ancient Indian democracy was a thing before Greece had even fully discovered togas. Among these Mahajanapadas was Magadha, a name that will become very important very soon. Think of it as the Netflix series that starts out low-key, but by season 3, it's running empires. Now, let's meet the first true emperor of India, a man who rose from obscurity to build one of the greatest empires the subcontinent would ever see. Chandragupta Maurya. We'll talk about strategy, elephants, secret spies, and an advisor who literally wrote the book on political manipulation, Chanakya. So stay tuned. History is about to get royal. Let's rewind to around 321 BCE. Alexander the Great had just left the Indian subcontinent. His troops were homesick, grumpy, and not entirely thrilled about elephants. But while the Greeks packed up and sulked back toward Babylon, they left behind a vacuum, a big, power-shaped hole that was practically begging to be filled. Enter Chandragupta Maurya, a man whose origin story is part Cinderella, part military thriller, and part political chess match with extra war elephants on top. But before we crown him, let's back up. At the time, the dominant power in northern India was Magadha, ruled by the Nanda dynasty. They were rich, powerful, and according to most ancient sources, wildly unpopular. The king, Dhanananda, was said to be arrogant, corrupt, and possibly the kind of guy who'd double dip at royal banquets. Now, this part gets murky. Ancient texts like the Mudra-Rakshasa, Buddhist chronicles, and Greek accounts all agree on one thing. People didn't like the Nandas. What they don't agree on is exactly how Chandragupta went from guy on the street to guy who owns the street. Some say he was born into a lowly family. Others claim royal lineage. Either way, he had ambition in his bones and destiny in his sandals. But destiny doesn't fund revolutions, which is why he needed a mentor. If Chandragupta was the sword, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, was the brain. Think Machiavelli meets Sun Tzu, meets that one professor who terrifies you into learning. He was a Brahmin scholar, a master of economics, diplomacy, and revenge, especially revenge. Legend says Chanakya was once insulted by the Nanda king. Instead of tweeting about it, he vowed to destroy the dynasty entirely. Petty? Yes. Effective? Very. He found Chandragupta, saw raw potential and said, "You, my friend, are going to conquer India." And then they got to work. Step 1. Gather forces. Chandragupta didn't have royal backing, but he did have charisma. He rallied rebels, disaffected soldiers, and mercenaries. Basically, the Avengers of ancient India, if everyone was armed with spears and mild historical uncertainty. Step 2. Take Magadha. The exact battle strategies are lost to time, but we know that after years of conflict and intrigue, including fake treaties, propaganda, and the occasional backstab, the Nanda dynasty was overthrown. Dhanananda was out. Chandragupta was in. Step 3. Expand ruthlessly. And expand he did. With Magadha as his capital and Chanakya as his prime minister, Chandragupta went full imperial mode. He didn't just conquer cities, he reorganized society. The empire stretched from the Hindu Kush in the west to Bengal in the east and deep into the Deccan in the south. It was one of the largest empires in Indian history and certainly the most organized. Chanakya wrote the Arthashastra, a kind of government manual meets power playbook. It covered everything: taxation, espionage, agriculture, marriage laws, and how to use secret agents disguised as monks. Seriously, the Mauryan administration was a bureaucratic beast. Think detailed census, land surveys, regulated weights and measures, and postal services. If something moved, the state probably had a department for it. And let's not forget the army, massive, disciplined, and often accompanied by war elephants, which were the ancient equivalent of tanks with tusks. Now, remember Alexander's leftovers? After he left, a Greek general named Seleucus I Nicator tried to claim parts of northwestern India. Chandragupta wasn't having it. Around 305 BCE, the two sides clashed, but instead of dragging it out, they did something shockingly mature. They negotiated. Chandragupta agreed to marry a Seleucid princess, maybe. Gifted 500 war elephants, definitely. And in return, gained control of huge chunks of territory in modern-day Afghanistan and Iran. Seleucus even sent an ambassador to Chandragupta's court, Megasthenes, who later wrote about Indian society, culture, and geography in his book Indica. Most of Indica is lost, but ancient authors quote it like it was the hottest take of the year. He described Pataliputra, the Mauryan capital, as a massive city with grand palaces, lush gardens, and moats full of crocodiles. Whether that last bit was metaphor or marketing, we may never know. Then, in a twist no one saw coming, Chandragupta walked away. According to Jain tradition, after years of rule, Chandragupta abdicated the throne, embraced Jainism, and retired to a life of spiritual austerity in southern India. He fasted, meditated, and eventually died by Salakana, a ritual Jain fast unto death. From empire builder to renunciate, his life was a full arc. From bloodshed to peace, from crown to cave. Whether you see that as redemption, regret, or just a dramatic retirement plan, it was unprecedented. Chandragupta Maurya wasn't just the first emperor of India, he was the blueprint. He proved that political unity was possible. that a subcontinent divided by rivers, languages, and rival tribes could be brought under one administration. He built roads, minted coins, and created institutions that would outlive him by centuries. And he did it not with divine right, but with strategy, patience, and a suspiciously well-read advisor. Next, we'll meet Bindusara, Chandragupta's son, who inherited an empire, expanded it, and kept the peace with minimal drama. But looming just beyond his reign is the Mauryan dynasty's most famous and most complicated ruler, Ashoka the Great. War, remorse, enlightenment, and rock edicts are coming your way. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. If Chandragupta was the thunderclap that shook the subcontinent, then Bindusara was the echo that held it steady. History doesn't always remember the middle kings. They're the ones who inherit empires, maintain peace, and quietly build on what came before, without a dramatic origin story or a PR team of Greek ambassadors. But sometimes, that's exactly what an empire needs. So light another lamp, get comfortable, and let's meet the man who ruled between revolution and remorse. A king who may not have etched his name into rock like his son did, but whose legacy laid the foundation for one of the most transformative reigns in Indian and world history. Bindusara was the son of Chandragupta Maurya, and quite possibly a Seleucid princess. If that's true, he was India's first known royal with a Greek mom and an empire for a nursery. He grew up in Pataliputra, the Mauryan capital, a city of bureaucracy, elephants, and spies. If you were a young prince here, your bedtime stories probably involved tax policy and diplomatic intrigue, and your babysitters were probably trained in 6 forms of hand-to-hand combat. Bindusara inherited the throne around 297 BCE, after his father abdicated to become a Jain monk. No civil war, no assassination, just a peaceful transfer of power, which in ancient monarchies is as rare as a tiger in a yoga class. Historical records on Bindusara are sparse. The Buddhist texts are mostly quiet. The Jain sources have already moved on to asceticism and cave dwelling. The Greek accounts ? Still obsessed with Chandragupta. But here's what we do know, pieced together from fragments and foreign scribes. 1. He expanded the empire further south. While Chandragupta had stopped at the Vindhya hills, Bindusara pushed deeper into the Deccan plateau, bringing 16 more kingdoms into the Mauryan fold. These were not tiny village conquests. We're talking strategic trade hubs and mineral-rich territories, aka the ancient Indian equivalent of locking down all the Wi-Fi routers and spice routes. 2. He kept the peace. Bindusara managed to hold together an empire that stretched across thousands of miles and dozens of languages, cultures, and religions. No major rebellions, no palace coups. Just smooth, highly centralized administration, backed by a terrifyingly efficient spy network. Think of it as the world's most polite surveillance state. 3. He was on good terms with the Greeks. Bindusara maintained diplomatic relations with Antiochus I, the Seleucid king of the time. In fact, when Antiochus sent him a gift of sweet wine, dried figs, and a philosopher, Bindusara reportedly accepted everything, except the philosopher. Either he already had enough philosophers, or he knew better than to let a Greek intellectual start asking questions in the palace. 4. He had many sons, and at least one of them was Ashoka. The rest of his children remain mostly footnotes, which is either tragic or strategic. Bindusara wasn't just known by one name. Jain texts call him Simhasena, lion-armored. Buddhist sources refer to him as Bindusara Amitragata, or destroyer of enemies. His Greek contacts called him Amitrochates, a garbled but impressive-sounding name that sounds like someone you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley or on a battlefield. But despite the dramatic titles, he doesn't appear to have been bloodthirsty. Most of his rule focused on consolidation, diplomacy, and internal development. His administration refined tax collection, reinforced trade networks, and improved infrastructure. In short, he was the Mauryan Empire's operations manager. Not flashy, but vital. Under Bindusara's rule, the Mauryan Empire was one of the most powerful political entities in the world. The economy thrived under a centralized system of taxation and state-controlled trade. Everything from agriculture to mining was managed with a mix of spreadsheets, mental ones probably, and local governors called amatyas. Religion remained pluralistic. The empire respected Jainism, Buddhism, Vedic rituals, and local tribal beliefs. Because when your kingdom stretches from Afghanistan to Karnataka, picking religious fights is bad for business. Law enforcement was, let's say, comprehensive. The Dandashastra, science of punishment, was still in effect. Spies were everywhere, informants were common, and most people behaved, not necessarily out of virtue, but because they didn't want to end up vanished. Still, most citizens lived peacefully. The roads were patrolled, the granaries were full, and if you didn't commit treason, you could live a fairly stable life with reasonable odds of not being trampled by an elephant. Bindusara ruled for about 25 years, and when he died, somewhere around 273 BCE, there was a problem, a big one. He had many sons, but no clear line of succession. According to some stories, a bloody power struggle followed. Some sources say Ashoka had to fight off his brothers to take the throne. Others hint that the court ministers invited Ashoka in, knowing he was the only one capable of holding the empire together. Either way, by the time the royal dust settled, Ashoka was emperor, and a lot of his brothers weren't alive anymore. Family drama, ancient edition. Bindusara isn't remembered as a conqueror or a philosopher. He didn't write treatises. He didn't found a religion. But he did something even harder. He sustained power in a time of transition. He inherited an empire and didn't break it. He expanded it, stabilized it, and passed it on. His rule wasn't flashy. It was functional. And in doing so, he set the stage for the Mauryan Empire's most dramatic act, the rise of Ashoka the Great, a king who began his reign with blood and ended it with stone-carved apologies. Next we meet the man who changed everything. From brutal warrior to enlightened ruler, Ashoka's story is part epic, part therapy session, and entirely unforgettable. Edicts, empires, and ethical overhauls. Every dynasty has its legend. Egypt had Ramses, Rome had Augustus, and India had Ashoka. A king whose reign was written in conquest, carved in stone, and softened by something incredibly rare in ancient history: remorse. So if you're settling in, get cozy. Maybe light some incense, and prepare for a story that starts in blood, pivots into philosophy, and ends with a transformation so profound it left the Indian subcontinent echoing for millennia. This is not just history. This is a redemption arc that actually stuck. Meet Ashoka, the general with a god complex. Ashoka was born around 304 BCE, likely one of many sons of Bindusara. Not the heir, not the favorite, just one of the options. He grew up in Pataliputra, among palace intrigue, elite tutors, and an empire that spanned nearly all of India. He was reportedly sharp, fearless, and not particularly known for cuddling puppies. His early reputation: ruthless, efficient, the kind of guy you'd want leading a military campaign, but probably not dating your daughter. Buddhist texts describe him as so cruel in his youth that he was nicknamed Chandragupta, Ashoka the Fierce. Not exactly a moniker that looks good on coins. When his father died around 273 BCE, Ashoka didn't just step up to the throne, he fought for it. Some sources claim he killed his half-brothers to claim power. Others suggest it was more of a strategic reorganization of the family tree. Either way, by 268 BCE, Ashoka was emperor, crowned, armed, unapologetic. And then he did what emperors do best. He looked at a map and asked, "What's left?" The Kalinga kingdom, on the eastern coast of India, modern-day Odisha, was wealthy, independent, and crucial to trade. But it wasn't part of the Mauryan Empire. So in 261 BCE, Ashoka attacked. The war was brutal, fierce resistance, massive casualties, the kind of slaughter that makes ancient historians flinch. According to Ashoka's own later inscriptions, 150,000 were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many times that number perished. And just like that, the war was won. But Ashoka didn't feel victorious. Standing on the battlefield, surrounded by corpses and smoking ruins, something broke. Not his empire, his conscience. For a man who had crushed rebellions, conquered cities, and possibly assassinated his way to the top, this wasn't weakness. It was something stronger. It was a full-on moral awakening. After Kalinga, Ashoka didn't just feel bad. He changed, radically. He publicly renounced war. Not just in a, "hey, let's not do that again" way, but in a systematic, empire-wide policy shift. He embraced Dhamma, a concept derived from the Buddhist idea of Dharma, but adapted to suit a multi-faith, multicultural empire. Ashoka's Dhamma was less about monasteries and meditation, and more about compassion, tolerance, ethical governance, and welfare for all beings. And he didn't just preach it, he carved it into rock, literally. Ashoka launched one of the earliest and most effective mass communication campaigns in human history. Across the empire, he had over 30 edicts carved into pillars, boulders, and cave walls. These weren't boring royal decrees. These were raw, emotional, often personal confessions and commitments. He talks about his remorse after Kalinga. He apologizes for past actions. He encourages religious tolerance. He bans animal sacrifices at the palace. He asks governors to treat prisoners humanely. He even worries about how he's being perceived in distant provinces. One rock edict reads, "All men are my children." It's hard to think of another ruler in ancient history who saw governance as parenthood instead of domination. Oh, and he sent missionaries abroad, to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, possibly even the Mediterranean, to spread the message of peace and ethical living. Ashoka, it seems, wanted to conquer the world's conscience. Ashoka is often credited with turning Buddhism from a minor Indian sect into a global religion. But here's the thing, he didn't force it. He didn't make Buddhism the state religion. He didn't dismantle Hinduism or outlaw Jainism. Instead, he promoted coexistence. His idea of Dhamma was ethical, not dogmatic. It was about how to live well, not who to worship. He built stupas, funded monasteries, and supported the Buddhist Sangha. But he also protected other faiths, reminding his officials that insulting another religion is like insulting your own. Imagine that. a ruler of the ancient world preaching interfaith harmony on stone pillars while building rest houses for travelers and wells for villagers. And this was centuries before modern concepts of human rights, civil society, or Yelp reviews for royal policies. In his final years, Ashoka was no longer feared, he was revered. He had turned from warrior to monk emperor, a symbol of humility, a figure of quiet authority. He didn't abolish the army. He didn't dismantle the government. He simply redirected its purpose, from conquest to compassion. His last edicts show a man still deeply engaged with governance, but more focused on legacy than law. Less king, more teacher. Ashoka died around 232 BCE, after nearly 40 years on the throne. The empire, sadly, would not last long without him. But his ideas, those outlived everything. Ashoka's memory faded for centuries, until British archaeologists in the 19th century started noticing ancient pillars scattered across India. The language, Brahmi; the message, Dhamma; the author, Devanampiya Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, he who looks with affection. That turned out to be Ashoka. Today, his lion capital is India's national emblem. His chakra, wheel of law, spins at the center of India's flag. And his example of power tempered by ethics remains one of the most compelling leadership models in world history. He was an emperor who ruled a continent and chose kindness, who crushed his enemies and then apologized to their ghosts. He didn't just change India, he changed the idea of what power could be. So what happened after Ashoka? Spoiler: things didn't go great. Succession crises, weakening control, and the slow unraveling of one of history's greatest empires. The golden age is about to crack. Every empire has a golden age. The Mauryans, they had Ashoka. And then they had problems, big ones. Succession woes, power struggles, economic headaches, and the creeping realization that you can't run a hyper-centralized bureaucracy with spiritual slogans and fond memories. So, welcome to the come down. Grab a metaphorical hard hat, because we're about to witness how an empire, once held together by elephants, edicts, and ethical overhauls, begins to unravel, one underpaid governor at a time. Ashoka died around 232 BCE, leaving behind a massive empire, carved in stone and haunted by his legacy. He had at least one son, Kunala, a prince who, according to legend, was blinded by palace intrigue and thus unfit to rule. Another figure, Dasharatha, likely his grandson, took the throne instead. Now, Dasharatha wasn't incompetent. In fact, he continued some of Ashoka's Dhamma-focused policies and even issued a few edicts of his own. But let's be honest, following Ashoka is like being the band that plays after the Beatles. Even if you're decent, no one remembers you. Especially when your biggest accomplishment is kept the empire semi-intact for a while. After Dasharatha, things get murkier than a monsoon in Magadha. Successive kings, Samprati, Shalishuka, Devavarman, and a few others, tried to hold the empire together. They failed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, like sand slipping through imperial fingers. So what went wrong? Let's count the ways. First succession drama, the soap opera edition. The Mauryan system wasn't built for smooth transitions. There was no clear line of succession, no crown prince system, just a vague assumption that someone competent would emerge, possibly after some fratricide. Without Ashoka's authority or charisma, later kings struggled to control the vast administrative machine their ancestors had built. Governors grew bold, vassal states grew rebellious, and the center began to wobble. 2. An empire too big to breathe. At its peak, the Mauryan Empire covered 5 million square kilometers, stretching from the Afghan highlands to the Tamil coast. It was big, really big, and it was expensive. Keeping roads maintained, armies supplied, governors obedient, and tax collectors mildly honest required a level of coordination that, frankly, no one post-Ashoka seemed capable of managing. It was the ancient version of a software update that crashes halfway through and bricks your entire kingdom. Third, Dhamma fatigue. Ashoka's Dhamma worked when backed by his personal conviction, but it was hard to institutionalize kindness as a state policy, especially when provinces were fighting, tax revenues were dropping, and local lords were eyeing independence. Later rulers either failed to uphold Ashoka's moral momentum or tried to shift back toward realpolitik and military aggression. The result? Confused policies, moral whiplash, and a bureaucratic identity crisis. Fourth, invasion and internal erosion. While the core of the empire wobbled, opportunistic invaders took note. The northwest, once absorbed peacefully through diplomacy with the Greeks, now became vulnerable. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, Greek descendants of Alexander's campaigns, pushed into Mauryan territory. Some cities changed hands, others changed allegiance. Meanwhile, in the Deccan and southern India, local dynasties like the Satavahanas began asserting themselves. The Mauryan grip loosened, slowly, then rapidly. 5. The final blow, Pushyamitra Shunga. By around 185 BCE, the Mauryan Empire had reached its limit. The final straw? A coup. The last known Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, was assassinated by his own general, Pushyamitra Shunga, not in a dramatic battlefield duel, but during a military parade, in front of the troops, which is the ancient Indian equivalent of someone stabbing you at your birthday party while singing Happy Birthday. Pushyamitra then declared himself king and founded the Shunga dynasty. Just like that, the Mauryan line ended, not with an epic battle or a natural disaster, but with a cold, calculated knife to the back. Despite its collapse, the infrastructure of the Mauryan Empire outlasted its rulers. Roads continued to connect cities. Local languages evolved, but the Brahmi script persisted. Governance systems like land taxation and district administration survived and were later adapted by future empires. And Ashoka, his memory went underground, literally. His edicts, scattered across the subcontinent, were forgotten, misread, even buried. It wouldn't be until 2,000 years later, thanks to British archaeologists and a man named James Prinsep, that his words would be deciphered again. And suddenly, the stone pillars began to speak. Ashoka's ghost rose from the granite, and so did his empire, at least in memory. Yes, the Mauryan Empire collapsed, but its achievements shaped the DNA of Indian civilization. Political unity. Chandragupta proved it was possible. Ethical governance. Ashoka redefined what kingship could mean. Cross-cultural exchange. The empire brought together Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Central Asians under a shared system. Buddhism. Ashoka's support turned it into a global religion, influencing China, Japan, Tibet, and beyond. It's tempting to judge empires by how long they last. But sometimes, it's what they leave behind that matters more. Out of this chaos come new players. Indo-Greeks with golden coins, Tamil kingdoms with ancient poetry, and dynasties that defied time with trade, temples, and tenacity. The post-Mauryan world is louder, weirder, and filled with unexpected brilliance. South, the Mauryan Empire has fallen. The throne of India, once occupied by Chandragupta and Ashoka, now sits cold, cracked, and increasingly irrelevant. What comes next? Not another empire. Not yet. Instead, we get a patchwork quilt of kingdoms, stitched from ambition, foreign influence, local power, and more than a few dramatic betrayals. This is not the calm after the storm. It's the storm after the calm. But it's also one of the most dynamic, creative, and overlooked periods in Indian history. This is the age of Indo-Greek kings, Tamil poets, and political hot potatoes with gold-plated edges. Let's jump in. Enter the Greeks. Yes, they're still here. You'd think the Greeks left India when Alexander did. They didn't. Some of his former generals and their descendants stuck around in Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan, and slowly filtered back into the northwest of India. These weren't tourists. These were Indo-Greek kings, and they came armed with cavalry, coinage, and very confusing names. One of the most famous, Menander I, also known in Indian texts as Milinda. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was also a philosopher king. According to the Milinda Panha, a Buddhist dialogue between King Menander and the monk Nagasena, he asked deep questions about the nature of the self, impermanence, and whether a chariot is still a chariot if you remove all its parts. Socrates would have been proud, and at some point, Menander became a Buddhist, or at least a major patron. His coins, which were legendary for their beauty and bilingual Greek Brahmi inscriptions, often featured images of the Dharma wheel and the words King Menander, Saviour. Not bad for a guy from Macedonia. But Indo-Greek rule wasn't centralized. These were city kingdoms, not empires. Their rule faded by the 1st century BCE, overrun by other newcomers like the Scythians, aka Shakas, and the Parthians. The northwest of India, during this time, was less stable government and more cosmopolitan food court with swords. Meanwhile, back in the north, the Shunga dynasty, founded by Pushyamitra Shunga, yes, the guy who stabbed the last Mauryan, ruled from Pataliputra. Pushyamitra was a Brahmin and leaned heavily into Vedic orthodoxy. He rolled back Ashoka's Buddhist-friendly policies, sponsored Vedic sacrifices, and tried to revive Hindu ritualism. Some Buddhist texts claim he persecuted Buddhists. Others say that's propaganda. What we know, the Shungas were not Mauryas. They were smaller, less organized, and constantly under siege from within and without. They lasted about a century before being replaced by the Kanvas, who lasted 28 years. Seriously. A few reigns, a few coins, a couple inscriptions, and then poof. It's the historical equivalent of showing up to a party, saying hi, then immediately leaving because you forgot your charger. While the North was busy playing musical thrones, the South was doing something entirely different. It was writing poetry. Welcome to the Sangam period, a golden age of Tamil culture, roughly spanning 300 BCE to 300 CE. No single king ruled the South. Instead, we had 3 major dynasties, each with their own flair. Cholas, aggressive, seafaring, and excellent at temple building. Cheras, traders with deep connections to the Arabian Sea. Pandyas, patrons of art, literature, and occasionally, war elephants. But the real stars, the Sangam poets, writing in early Tamil, they composed epic love poems, battle songs, and philosophical verses that still make modern readers weepy. This was literature born from kingship and bloodshed, but also moonlight, longing, and awkward glances between palace courtiers. It was Game of Thrones meets Shakespeare, but with better weather and longer vowels. And these weren't just poems about emotions. They were historical records in disguise. They described wars, kings, invasions, and even Roman trade ships docking on the Tamil coast. Yes, the Romans were here too. While kingdoms were rising and falling faster than a monsoon banana stand, India's economy was booming. From the Indo-Greek north to the Tamil south, merchants were sailing across the Arabian Sea, braving the Bay of Bengal, and loading their cargo with black pepper, worth more than gold in Rome, cotton textiles, lightweight and status-boosting, pearls, gems, ivory, and exotic animals, and possibly the first early exports of zero, the concept, not the quantity. Indian ports like Bharuch, Arikamedu, and Muziris, now possibly Pattanam in Kerala, became bustling cosmopolitan hubs. Roman coins poured in. So did Greek wine, Mediterranean glass, and lots of imperial gossip. One Roman writer even complained about how much gold was being drained from the empire just to buy Indian luxuries. We call this cultural diffusion. Rome called it bankruptcy. It wasn't just spices and silk that travelled. Buddhism and Hinduism began spreading across Southeast Asia. Buddhist missionaries crossed the ocean. Hindu rituals were adapted in local courts. Sanskrit inscriptions appeared in places like Java, Bali, and Cambodia. This was the start of India's soft power empire. No armies, just ideas, art, and some very persuasive temple builders. This post-Mauryan world wasn't a step back. It was a reconfiguration. An India of many voices, many kingdoms, many experiments in culture, politics, and philosophy. It was chaotic, yes. But out of this chaos came richness, literary, spiritual, and economic. It laid the groundwork for the next great unifier, an empire that would rise not from Magadha or the north, but from the Deccan Plateau, with iron will, war elephants, and a ruler named after a celestial weapon. As the Deccan powers step into the spotlight, the Silk Roads stretch further, and the seeds of classical India begin to bloom. Its trade, temples, and the long road to the Gupta Golden Age. When empires fall, history usually holds its breath. But after the Mauryas collapsed and the north descended into royal whack-a-mole, the Deccan Plateau, that vast central stretch of India, quietly rolled up its sleeves and got to work. This is the story of the Satavahanas, a dynasty without drama in their branding, but with serious staying power. They didn't build the largest empire. They didn't crown the flashiest kings. But they did something even more impressive in ancient India. They lasted. So sit down. Maybe sip something fermented and historically inaccurate. Because we're entering an era of balance between North and South, power and pragmatism, Sanskrit and Prakrit. This is the bridge between India's ancient age of empires and its classical golden age. And it starts in the Deccan. Who were the Satavahanas? If the Mauryan dynasty was a firework, the Satavahanas were a slow-burning lantern. They likely emerged around the 2nd century BCE, shortly after Ashoka's final edict faded into stone, and the Shunga dynasty took the reins in the north. Originating in Andhra Pradesh or Maharashtra, the Satavahanas ruled a region crucial to India's geography, a crossroads of north-south trade, linking Tamil ports to Ganges cities and Arabian merchants to Chinese silk caravans. And they were here for the long haul. Depending on which coins and inscriptions you believe, they ruled for over 300 years, with brief interruptions by rivals and rebellions. Not bad for a dynasty few people today remember, unless they really liked archaeology or stamps. While several kings reigned over the centuries, one name stands out: Gautamiputra Satakarni. Yes, it's a mouthful. But so was his empire. He ruled around 78 to 102 CE, and under him, the Satavahanas pushed deep into both North and South India, defeating rivals like the Shakas, Western Kshatrapas, and halting foreign influence from sweeping through Gujarat and Malwa. His inscriptions proudly claim he uprooted the Kshatriyas, restored the Varna system, protected Brahmins, cows, and order. In other words, he styled himself as defender of tradition, while still being perfectly fine trading with Rome and printing his name in Prakrit, not Sanskrit, because even warriors love market access. His mother, Gautami Balashri, even commissioned inscriptions praising him, a rare moment in ancient India where a queen mother gets to narrate her son's triumphs like a very proud political ghostwriter. The Satavahanas weren't flashy, but they were incredibly efficient. Coinage. They minted coins in lead, copper, and silver, many with bilingual inscriptions. Prakrit in Brahmi script on one side, Tamil Brahmi, or regional markers on the other. Economic diversity meets aesthetic modesty. Religion. While they supported Brahmanism, they also heavily patronized Buddhism. This wasn't about confusion, it was policy. Temple grants to Hindu priests, cave donations to Buddhist monks. Everyone got something. No one rebelled. Trade. Ports like Kalyan, Nasik, and Sappara became major hubs. Roman coins, Egyptian glass, and Chinese silk flowed through Satavahana markets like it was Black Friday in togas. Architecture. They sponsored massive rock-cut cave complexes, especially at Ajanta, Nasik, and Kale. These weren't just religious spaces, they were art galleries, merchant lodges, and cultural flexes. The Kale Chaitya Hall, for example, isn't just a Buddhist prayer hall. It's a stone cathedral carved from living rock, with a wooden ribbed ceiling that still baffles architects. Because apparently, when you're carving a mountain, you might as well add decorative beams. Throughout their reign, the Satavahanas were constantly pushing and pulling between northern dynasties like the Kshatrapas and southern powers like the Cholas, Pandyas, and Cheras. They didn't always win. The Shaka Satavahana wars were legendary, lasting generations. At one point, the Western Kshatrapas under Nahapana even took over large swaths of the Deccan. But Gautamiputra Satakarni struck back, reclaimed territory, and had Nahapana's coins re-minted, not melted, just overstamped with Satavahana symbols, a kind of ancient I win sticker on your enemy's face. Later, the Satavahanas would lose ground again, before briefly recovering. By the time of Yajnashri Satakarni, their maritime trade reached its peak. But eventually, around 230 CE, the dynasty faded out, broken up into smaller regional kingdoms. No dramatic assassination, no final battle, just slow imperial fatigue, which, to be fair, is a very relatable way to end a dynasty. Why the Satavahanas mattered? You might be asking. They didn't rule all of India, so why do they matter? Because they held the middle. In a time when the subcontinent was split into countless mini-kingdoms, the Satavahanas, connected north and south, preserved and passed on Mauryan administrative traditions, facilitated cross-continental trade, helped Buddhist art and architecture flourish, set the stage for the next big act. Without the Satavahanas, the cultural and political threads that tied India together would have frayed into a dozen forgotten kingdoms. But instead, they held the loom. And what they wove was a cultural foundation for the next golden age. As the Satavahanas faded, Northern India was about to reorganize itself again. Out of the chaos would rise a new dynasty, Guptas, who would define the classical period of Indian history. Philosophy, mathematics, literature, astronomy, temples, epics. The Gupta Empire wasn't just a kingdom. It was a statement. This is what India can be when it breathes. But before the Guptas take the stage, a few more contenders will try their luck. Nagavanshis, Vakatakas, and tribal federations vying for control. It won't go well for most of them. The Guptas, a dynasty that branded itself with Sanskrit, scholarship, and subtle swagger. Get ready for Kalidasa's poetry, Aryabhata's numbers, and the political philosophy of keeping your enemies educated, but far away. India is about to glow. If ancient India were a symphony, the Gupta Empire would be its crescendo, rich, measured, and echoing across centuries. This was the age of mathematicians who wrote in verse, playwrights who rivaled Shakespeare, and kings who claimed divinity with a straight face, while simultaneously inventing decimal notation. And yet, beneath the gold leaf, this golden age was also complicated, contested, and not quite as universally golden as the title suggests. So pour some spiced milk, unroll a palm leaf manuscript, and get ready to meet a dynasty that turned knowledge into currency and Sanskrit into soft power. This is India's classical age, and the Guptas are about to conduct the orchestra. The Guptas began humbly. They weren't descendants of Chandragupta Maurya or warlords from the Deccan. They were likely landed elites, possibly Vaishyas, merchant class, who rose to prominence in Magadha around the 3rd century CE. Their founder, Sri Gupta, was basically the "Hi, I'm just getting started" of dynasty building. But by the time his grandson, Chandragupta I, came to power around circa 320 CE, things accelerated fast, very fast. He married into the powerful Lichavi clan, a political move so effective it practically came with a "Congratulations, you've unlocked half the Ganges plain" achievement badge. Chandragupta. I assumed the title of Maharajadiraja, King of Kings, which was less humble and more "I've arrived, please kneel." And with that, the Gupta Empire began. Samudragupta, the emperor with a soft face and a hard army. He ruled from about 335 to 375 CE, and we know he was kind of a big deal because he told us. In verse, the Allahabad pillar inscription, carved in elegant Sanskrit by court poet Harisena, lists Samudragupta's achievements like a resume written by a hype man. 12 kings defeated in battle. 9 rulers made into tribute-paying vassals. Southern kingdoms humbled but spared. Border tribes either crushed or impressed into submission. Also, played the lute. Yes, really. This guy conquered half the subcontinent and had time to be a musician. Coins show him holding a veena, stringed instrument, because sometimes you just have to assert dominance musically. Samudragupta's strategy was surgical. Annex the north, subjugate the south, and leave a buffer of vassal states to avoid endless rebellions. He didn't just conquer, he curated, and his empire flourished, economically, culturally, and administratively. Samudragupta's son, Chandragupta II, aka Vikramaditya, meaning son of valor, carried the torch and turned it into a spotlight. His reign, circa 375 to 415 CE, is considered the zenith of the Gupta Empire. Why? Defeated the Shakas, Western Kshatrapas, in Gujarat and Western India. finally reclaiming the legacy of the Satavahanas, expanded maritime trade, particularly with Southeast Asia and the Roman East, patronized scholars, artists, mathematicians, and Kalidasa. India's answer to Homer and Shakespeare rolled into one poetic powerhouse, issued exquisite gold coins with gods, goddesses, and his own heroic poses. If Instagram existed in 400 CE, he'd have been the sponsored face of Sanskrit chic. He also built one of the greatest architectural marvels of ancient India, the Iron Pillar of Delhi, a 7-meter-high, rust-resistant wonder that still stands today. It doesn't corrode, it doesn't wobble, it just outlasts, like the Gupta name itself. A golden age. But for whom? Let's talk about the phrase golden age. Because yes, the Gupta era was golden, but mostly for those at the top. Science and mathematics. This was the age of Aryabhata, who gave the world, the concept of zero, the value of pi to 4 decimal places, a rotating spherical Earth, 1,000 years before Europe caught up, trigonometry, astrology, and equations that make your head spin. Literature. Poets like Kalidasa penned Shakuntala, Meghaduta, and verses about love, loss, seasons, and cosmic order. Language and identity. Sanskrit wasn't just a language, it was a branding tool. It became the lingua franca of courts, literature, and power. Religion. Hinduism flourished. Vishnu temples rose. Puranic myths crystallized. Deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and Devi began to dominate spiritual life. The Bhakti movement, personal devotion to gods, began to stir. But Buddhism and Jainism declined in royal favor. Lower castes and tribal communities remained mostly outside the cultural party. Women, once more visible in Mauryan and Satavahana inscriptions, saw increasing restrictions, especially in upper caste society. So yes, it was golden, but not entirely glittering for everyone. During the reign of Chandragupta II, a Chinese monk named Faxian, Fa-Hian, visited India. He travelled for 15 years, documenting Buddhist sites, monasteries, and Gupta society. His review: people were prosperous, punishments were mild, taxes were reasonable, hospitals existed, and Buddhism, while fading from royal patronage, still thrived in local communities. If Yelp had existed, Faxian would have given Gupta India a solid 4.7 stars, points docked for the occasional tiger. By the end of the 5th century, storm clouds gathered. Skandagupta, the last great Gupta ruler, repelled the Hunas, a branch of the Huns, around 455 CE. But the war drained the treasury. Subsequent rulers were weaker, regional governors more autonomous. Feudalism crept in. Land grants to Brahmins and officials increased, weakening central power and encouraging local kingship. And by 550 CE, the Gupta Empire, like the Mauryans before them, fractured, leaving behind a mosaic of regional kingdoms. But unlike the Mauryans, the Gupta legacy lingered. They had built not just an empire, but a cultural identity that would influence India for 1,000 years. Sanskrit, temple architecture, mathematical foundations, and the very idea of a unified, enlightened dharmic ruler all bear the Gupta stamp. Next, we journey into the political kaleidoscope of post-Gupta India. The Pallavas, the Chalukyas, the Pushyabhutis, and the temple builders who turned sandstone into scripture. Fragmentation. Yes, but also the birth of India's medieval soul. As the Gupta Empire faded into the mist of history, India didn't collapse. It diversified. Gone was the towering umbrella of empire. In its place emerged regional dynasties, each carving its name into stone, each competing not just for territory, but for culture, faith, and identity. What followed wasn't chaos. It was a renaissance of reinvention. New kingdoms, new art styles, new religious movements. This is the era of the Pallavas, Chalukyas, Harshas, and temple architects with chisels sharper than royal swords. And though fragmented, this period laid the groundwork for India's medieval character. So step carefully. The stones beneath your feet might be inscribed with gods, battles, and centuries-old ambition. The Pushyabhutis and Harshavardhana, a northern flame. Let's start with one of the last attempts to rekindle northern unity. Harshavardhana, the crown jewel of the Pushyabhuti dynasty. Ruling from Thanisar, modern Haryana, and later Kanauj, Harsha ascended around 606 CE, after the assassination of his brother. Like many great kings, he took power amidst blood and quickly turned it into order. Harsha was a skilled diplomat, a competent general, a Buddhist by inclination but tolerant toward Hindus and Jains, a writer, yes, he authored Sanskrit plays. Under Harsha, northern India briefly unified again, from Gujarat to Bengal, though not as tightly as under the Guptas. His administration was lighter, relying more on vassals and alliances than on full control. But his rule signaled something important. Kanauj, a city once minor, now became the symbolic throne of North India. After Harsha's death around 647 CE, his empire fractured. No heir strong enough, no general loyal enough. And once again, the subcontinent tilted toward regionalism. Down south, while the Guptas and Harshas played chess in the north, the Pallavas were busy inventing a new aesthetic, one made of granite, gods, and grandeur. Based in Kanchipuram, the Pallavas rose around the 4th century CE, but reached their peak under kings like Mahendravarman I, witty, artistic, and known for his plays and rock-cut cave temples. Narasimhavarman I, who defeated the Chalukyas and built the legendary shore temples of Mahabalipuram. The Pallavas were great patrons of architecture, pioneering rock-cut temples that evolved into the structural temples of medieval India. Supporters of Shaivism, though tolerant of Buddhism and Jainism. Political players, frequently at war with Chalukyas, but also in contact with Southeast Asia. Their legacy, the Dravidian temple style, towering gopurams, pillared halls, and complex iconography that would define South Indian sacred spaces for centuries. While the Pallavas shaped the south, the Chalukyas dominated the Deccan like seasoned power brokers. Their capital was Vatapi, modern-day Badami, and their greatest king, Pulakeshin II, circa 610 to 642 CE, was a military genius and a diplomatic star. He defeated Harsha's northern expansion, the first major south versus north checkmate since ancient times. Controlled key trade routes, patronized a blend of Shaivism, Vaishnavism, Jainism, and early tantric traditions. But what truly immortalized them was architecture. At Aihole, Patadakal, and Badami, the Chalukyas developed Proto-Dravidian and Nagara temple styles, experimenting with forms that would later be perfected by the Cholas and Hoysalas. Think of this period as India's architectural adolescence, full of bold lines, new ideas, and a very real sense of sacred swagger. Meanwhile, something was bubbling beneath the surface, in hymns, in poetry, and in devotion that transcended caste and priestly authority. The Bhakti movement began to stir. In Tamilakam, Alvas, devotees of Vishnu, and Nayanas, devotees of Shiva, composed emotional, deeply personal poems about love, surrender, and divine connection. Their works, written in vernacular Tamil, rejected rigid ritualism and emphasized direct access to God. This wasn't rebellion, it was reform from within. And though it began quietly, it would eventually reshape Indian religion, giving rise to regional devotional sects, temple networks, and literary canons that endure to this day. Around 630 CE, the Chinese monk Xuanzang, traveled across India for over 17 years, documenting everything from temples to taxes. His observations: Buddhism was still present but declining in the north. Hinduism, especially Shaivism and Vaishnavism, was resurgent. The Gupta legacy lingered in cultural practices. Harsha's court was cosmopolitan, with debates between Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains held openly. Xuanzang's writings became a goldmine for historians and a subtle obituary for Indian Buddhism, which by now had retreated to monasteries, often disconnected from political power. Fragmented, yes. Stagnant, absolutely not. While there was no single ruler of India during this time, there was explosive cultural production, a mature literary scene in Sanskrit, Tamil, and Kannada, innovations in temple engineering, metal casting, and iconography, trade with Southeast Asia, China, and the Middle East, a rising belief that kings should be protectors of Dharma, patrons of temples, and builders of legacy. This was an India that reinvented itself through diversity, not despite it. Now, we close this ancient saga with the rise of the Cholas, a dynasty that conquered seas, built bronze deities, and carved their empire into stone and story. From Southeast Asia to Sri Lanka, the Chola name would ring like a temple bell. The Chola Empire, bronze gods, maritime power, and the southern sun that rose over the seas. We've crossed centuries of kings and kingdoms, from Chandragupta's conquest to Ashoka's remorse, from Gupta scholars to southern sculptors. Now, in the final chapter of ancient India's timeline, we arrive at the Cholas, a dynasty that didn't just rule India. They sailed it. They sent navies across oceans, commissioned temples that still awe engineers, and cast bronze deities so exquisite, art historians just shake their heads in surrender. So stretch your legs, stand before a towering gopuram in your mind, and let's enter the story of a dynasty that turned the southern sun into an empire. The Cholas were old, like really old. They're mentioned in Ashokan edicts. They're in early Sangam poetry. But for centuries, they were minor regional rulers, overshadowed by bigger dynasties like the Pallavas and Pandyas. It wasn't until the 9th century CE, in the aftermath of Pallava decline, that they surged forward, rebranding themselves from local kings to imperial visionaries. And it all began with a king named Vijayalaya Chola, who captured Tanjore, around 850 CE and planted the Chola flag. From there, it was game on. Rajaraja Chola I, the builder of empires and temples. Fast forward to the turn of the first millennium. Enter Rajaraja Chola I, R. 985 to 1014 CE. A name that still echoes through Tamil Nadu like a war drum and a temple bell rolled into one. Rajaraja was a brilliant administrator, a ruthless conqueror, a devout Shaivite, and a man with a plan bigger than the Deccan. He conquered Sri Lanka, subdued the Pandyas and Cheras, brought Malabar, Kalinga, and parts of Karnataka under Chola rule, built the Brihadiswara temple at Tanjavur, one of the most awe-inspiring architectural feats in Indian history. This temple wasn't just a shrine, it was a political statement. Its towering Vimana, temple tower, made of granite and over 60 meters tall, dominated the landscape, a literal monument to Chola ambition. And it still stands, a millennium later. Rajaraja's son, Rajendra Chola I, R. 1014 to 1044 CE, said, "Nice empire, Dad. I'm going to need a bigger ocean." Rajendra marched all the way to the Ganges, defeating northern kingdoms and commemorating it by building a new capital, Gangaikonda Cholapuram. Launched naval expeditions to the Srivijaya Empire in modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia, disrupting trade and asserting Indian influence across the sea. Controlled key maritime routes that linked India to China, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. Promoted the building of irrigation systems, temples, and granaries. Under Rajendra, the Chola navy wasn't just defensive, it was imperial. This was India's rare moment of true maritime dominance, an empire with anchors, sails, and ambition that extended beyond the subcontinent, structured with provinces, mandalams, and districts, nadus, each carefully taxed and recorded, maintained by village-level bureaucracy that kept everything from grain stores to water tanks running smoothly. They kept detailed land surveys. They issued inscriptions across temples detailing donations, rights, and judicial decisions. It was governance in granite, permanent, visible, and hard to dispute. If the Cholas ruled with one hand, they created with the other. Their temples were sculptural museums, walls filled with deities, dancers, demons, and saints. But their bronze icons? Unmatched. The most famous, Nataraja, Shiva, as the cosmic dancer, balancing destruction and creation in a circle of fire. Cast using the lost wax method, these sculptures were more than religious symbols. They were expressions of divine rhythm, cosmic truth, and artistic perfection. The Chola bronzes weren't static. They moved, they danced, and they still do. Many are worshipped today, not behind glass, but beneath garlands. The Cholas were Shaivites, but inclusive. They patronized Vaishnava and Jain temples, embraced Bhakti poetry, especially the works of the Alvas and Nayanas, elevated temple priests, ritual specialists, and temple economies. Their temples weren't just spiritual centers, they were economic hubs, schools, art galleries, granaries, and symbols of state ideology. Temples were where faith met finance, and the gods were not just worshipped, they were governed. By the 12th century, Chola dominance began to slip. The Pandyas reasserted themselves in the south. The Hoysalas emerged in Karnataka. And internal strife, along with external invasions, began to unravel Chola control. By the 13th century, the Chola Empire faded, not erased, but absorbed into newer powers like the Vijayanagara Empire. But their temples remained. Their art remained. Their idea of India as a powerful, ocean-facing civilization remained. The legacy of ancient India. And so, our journey ends, not with a single king, but with an inheritance. A timeline of kingdoms and visionaries that gave the world. The concept of zero, Sanskrit drama and Tamil poetry, Buddhist compassion and Hindu cosmology, temples that touched the sky, empires that dared to imagine unity on a subcontinental scale, from the Indus cities to the Chola ports, from Mauryan edicts to Gupta gold, from Ashoka's remorse to Rajendra's navy. Ancient India wasn't a static civilization. It was a river, constantly flowing, reshaping, reflecting the sun. And though its kingdoms rose and fell, its ideas persisted. They became the roots of the modern. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this path with us, across time, stone, and story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's great civilizations. And if you ever visit a temple, a fort, or a lonely pillar in a field, listen. Sometimes history still speaks.